Welcome to the Acupuncture Outsider podcast. My name is Richard Hazel, and in the time it takes for you to commute to or from work, I hope to have shared something of interest about orthopedic acupuncture using motor points, trigger points, myofascial slings, neurofunctional acupuncture, segmental treatments, anything that crosses my mind that seems to be of interest. I hope you'll enjoy it. Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Acupuncture Outsider. This is Richard Hazel, and today is the second part of the sports performance optimization for overhead sports. The first half was really the lower body, the more proximal part of this kinetic chain. The kinetic chain goes from proximal to distal. And just a quick recap, we talked about ground reaction force and the power of the hips. 50% of the power for a baseball pitch comes from the hips. Very similar for volleyball spike, things like that. So I left off with the torso rotation, and we're going to start with the torso rotation because a big part of the baseball pitch, and starting with the windup where the hands start to separate, you've got the front leg that's going to come forward. The stride leg is going to be a powerful support and stabilizer. And the back drive leg is going to be doing that external rotation to drive the hip forward. But what's going to happen with the shoulder is really, really important when it comes to velocity. And getting the order correct is very, very important for avoiding injury. And I'll try to remember to talk about each of the muscles after I just talk about the movement. But you've got the cocking of the arm. So the early and late cocking of the arm. The early cocking is happening as the foot's coming forward. And then as the stride foot lands on the ground, the arm keeps going back into late cocking, where the shoulder can externally rotate. On elite pitchers, it can rotate as much as 175 degrees of external rotation. I think the optimal is considered 170 degrees of shoulder external rotation. If you work with patients and check external rotation, you probably know that many people were happy if they can get their arms straight up and down at 90 degrees. A lot of us were born with a little bit more than that. I, without any effort, can go to about 120 degrees of shoulder external rotation. But the elite pitchers have developed a super physiological external rotation, a superhuman ability to externally rotate their pitching shoulder to around 170 degrees. So that cocking phase with the front stride leg down is creating that elastic energy from the hip to shoulder separation that we talked about in the first part, so that if it's a right-handed pitcher, it's the left hip across the torso to the right arm, going back to that extreme external rotation. That stretch, that hip to shoulder separation is giving that elastic energy. They're going into this eccentric contraction and then quickly going to have a concentric contraction of the anterior oblique sling, which is going to be like pecs and serratus and obliques and the opposite adductor, plus the shoulder coming out of external rotation and going forward in the acceleration phase. So that acceleration phase is going to go, it has to come after the hip. The hip rotates, the torso rotates, then the shoulder goes into that acceleration phase. The elbow will start to extend before the arm reaches the front to kind of cut down on the drag that gives it a little bit more velocity. And then at the end, The forearm, when the arm is forward, it's like a whip. The forearm will go into more internal rotation so that the thumb is pointing down at the release. So at that end of acceleration, their arm is in full internal rotation. So they go from that extreme external rotation into the end stage of acceleration to the internal rotation. The ball is released, and that is now the deceleration stage. Basically, the shoulder has to go into a lot of eccentric contraction to basically decelerate and not have the shoulder separate. The rotator cuff muscles have to keep the centration, that glenohumeral stability. And after going into that extreme external rotation where there's this mobility stability paradox, at that external rotation, the rotator cuff is stabilizing that joint in the extreme external rotation. And then at the deceleration, after the ball's released, the posterior rotator cuff muscles, the infraspinatus and teres minor, are the most likely to be injured at that deceleration phase. It's a very strenuous thing for the shoulder at the end of that whip. And it's interesting because you would think that going into that external rotation would be the muscles, the rotator cuff muscles, that would be most likely to get injured, like the subscapularis. But in fact, it's the deceleration that causes the most injury. And it's going to be that infraspinatus and teres minor. The lat is hugely important for the acceleration phase. The arm goes back in cocking. The lat is being stretched optimally. And then that acceleration phase is going after the rotation of the torso. That lat is engaged and is going to increase that acceleration. So it's like a whip. And we know from studies that when the proximal to distal cadence is off and the rotation of the torso comes too soon, like with the hips, then there's a lot more strain on the shoulder and the elbow. The medial elbow, that ulnar collateral ligament, gets strained and injured a lot in baseball pitching. And it's usually because of a break in that kinetic chain where the torso is rotating too soon, and it puts a valgus strain on the inside of the elbow. When I work with pitchers, I typically see an extremely hypertonic pronator teres, and it makes perfect sense because at the end of that pitch, when the elbow gets locked out, then the forearm rotates. In elite pitchers, it rotates at 7,000 degrees rotation at that end of the pitch. Enormously fast internal rotation. So you'll see pronator teres gets very, very tight. And I highly recommend you work on that pronator teres to give them their flexibility back, because then they have even more power for that end range of acceleration before they go into deceleration. Staying on top of the infraspinatus and teres minor is really, really helpful to keep them out of injury of those muscles, because the tighter they get, the less flexible they are, the less eccentric contraction they have, the less deceleration power that they have, more likely they're going to have an injury. So you stay on top of that. The triceps are huge. In the literature, I don't see a ton of talk about tricep injury, but you'll find hypertonic triceps in baseball pitchers. So you really want to stay on top of that. It's a big part of the pitch. Anconius injuries all day long on pitchers. You see this all the time. It is the external, end range of elbow extension is anconius. Anconius helps stabilize as well against the pronation. So it's probably getting really strained in the deceleration phase. when the ball is released. So check anconeus on your pitchers, especially if they're starting to get like a tennis elbow. That'd be the first thing I check. I've seen it many times on baseball pitchers. So the that whole kinetic chain needs to happen in the right order. I like to work on middle deltoid to help increase overhead reach and shoulder external rotation. The middle deltoid is an abductor, but when it's tight, which it will be on many athletes, it does restrict some of their shoulder mobility in external rotation. And I would say also anterior deltoid gets some shortening that affects that external rotation as well. You will see anterior deltoid and coracobrachialis getting tight or injured on baseball pitchers. Makes perfect sense for that overuse injury. The let's see, what else was I going to talk about? The rotator. Teres major is not a rotator cuff muscle, but it's an internal rotator. So as you can imagine, keeping that optimal is definitely going to help their external rotation and their pitching strength, the power that they're going to get. Remember last episode I talked about how when the order is wrong, there's up to 9.2% of the athlete's body weight increased on the shoulder girdle, on the shoulder. So we're talking a lot of pounds for like 200-pound athlete. That's like 18 or 18 plus pounds of stress added to the shoulder because they didn't rotate in the right order. It has to be the hips, then the torso, then the arm. But the arm is going to cock back, start to go back even before the stride leg hits. Then as the stride leg hits, they go into the late cocking phase where they go into that extreme external rotation. And that's when that elastic power is going to kick in. They're going to get to the end range. That's that stretch. That stretch shortening cycle is going to give them power on the concentric part for like a whip effect for the lats and the upper body, and then the shoulder, arm, elbow, wrist. And then that, like I said, that deceleration is the danger zone. The arm is trying not to fly off, not to fly out of the socket. So that deceleration is really important, and keeping the eccentric strength in the external rotators is really, really helpful. When you have medial elbow pain on a pitcher, pronator teres is number one, but you're going to see palmaris longus. You're going to see the flexors of the fingers getting involved. You're going to see the flexor carpi ulnaris getting involved. All of those flexors in the forearm are going to get overused. So you have to stay on top of those. If you're dealing with that elbow pain, that medial epicondylitis, also check the medial tricep, which also causes medial epicondylitis. And then conversely, if the anconeus is really regularly overused, you'll see some brachioradialis, extensor communis, extensor digitorum communis, the extensors of the fingers. All of those can get tight, and probably part of the deceleration injury that you're going to see, the anconeus, brachioradialis, extensors of the fingers. You're definitely going to see those getting tight on pitchers. So if you're seeing lateral epicondylitis, look for those muscles to be injured, as well as the lateral head of the tricep, for all the reasons I just mentioned about extension of the elbow at the end of acceleration and then going into that deceleration. So those are the injuries you're going to see a lot. When I'm working with a pitcher, I'm treating the subscapularis, I'm treating the teres major to help with that external rotation, as well as the middle head of the deltoid. I'm looking at overhead reach, so I'm treating the pecs, pec major, both heads, the pec minor, and the lat. Definitely treat the lats. That is so much power for overhead sports. They get so much great eccentric contraction with the lat before a pitch or a base or a volleyball spike. So keeping the lat as elastic as possible is really going to give them a lot of velocity on a hit, on hitting the ball or throwing the ball. The lat is hugely important. The pecs are hugely important. Pec major is huge. The clavicular head of the pec major does shoulder flexion, and that's pitching all day long. Shoulder flexion is that cocking phase. So shoulder flexion is going to be kind of overused for someone who pitches a lot. So look for that clavicular head of the pec to be tight, hypertonic, and short. And it can definitely start pulling the arm into internal rotation and affecting the external rotation that they need in that late cocking phase. So, so those are the key points that I wanted to talk about for the second half. The optimization for overhead sports. Really look at pecs and lats, rotator cuff, triceps. Biceps too. Not as much, but you'll see tight biceps on pitchers. And then those forearm muscles, the pronator teres is huge. And then anconeus is huge. Those are the ones that you're going to see in pain or having problems. Okay, so that's it for this week. I hope you enjoyed it, and I will talk to you soon. Thanks.